Hello, I'm Ruth Goodman, and today we're going to be talking about what the Victorians did in their free time. We discover exactly how little leisure time most people had, and what they did with those precious snatched hours. We will also look at how people in towns took up sport and gardening for fun, plus the pleasure found in reading a book with a nice cup of cocoa. The Victorian working life was generally extraordinarily long. Take, for example, the diary of Hannah Skoda. Now, she was working as a maid-of-all-work in the 1860s, and in her diary she records day after day, starting at 6 a.m. and not finishing until gone 11 at night. The few moments that she gets time off are rare, scattered, and often unplanned. There is a reference, for example, for her managing to squeeze in a walk along the pier with her friend Ellen, or maybe meeting up with another servant on Christmas afternoon. However, as the Victorian period moved forward, things did begin to improve for at least some members of Victorian society. The first to really benefit, perhaps, were male office workers. From about the 1860s onwards, their working hours begin to sort of tidy in a little bit, become a little bit shorter. And these men, often low middle class, that sort of standard, were looking around for something to do with their spare time. And they came up with cricket. There were hundreds of clubs up and down the country, and people were looking for a space to play. All sorts of bits of open ground got pressed into service, many of them having to double up for several clubs. As time went on, though, cricket began to change more from a doing into a spectating sort of a sport, and that's probably down to the railways. It was just way more easier to travel. So larger crowds began to gather at popular matches where big name players were involved. A similar sort of thing happened with football, although a little later. It was the 1880s that really see football take off, and at a moment when people's work practices change. This is the moment in which the 56-hour working week begins to become standardised across a whole range of industries. The 10-hour day, 10 hours during 5 days of the week, and then a half day on Saturday, leaving working class men with a free Saturday afternoon. So what were they going to do with that time? Well, they didn't really feel that they belonged in cricket. It had already been taken over by office workers in a way. So they looked around, and this new sport was emerging, football. It really didn't have the rules of today. All sorts of things were still undecided. I mean, even how many people there would be in the team, the size of the pitch, all of these things were still being worked out. But just like with cricket, this early enthusiasm was for playing, not necessarily watching, for playing. And they were suddenly in competition with the older cricket clubs for space to play. Many of them amalgamated so that they could use the same piece of ground. And then gradually, just like it had happened in cricket, it became more of a spectator sport. Rather than a thing you did, became more a thing you watched, that you travelled to other towns and cities on the railway in order to watch. Male leisure, therefore, had already become heavily associated with sport and the pub. A nice warm place at the end of the day where you could finally take the weight off your feet, a heated place where you could finally warm up, get yourself a good drink and sit with your mostly male colleagues. They were inviting places as far as most working class Victorians were concerned, and they were everywhere. One estimate suggests that within towns and cities there was one pub for every 30 households. Usually small, like this one, somebody's front room. And which pub you went to sort of depended on who else went. You know, it was almost like a sort of informal club. You'd see the same people in your local every time you went and sat in the warmth, talk to your mates, drink a pint. And that was all very well if it was one pint. But as we all know, one pint leads to another. So in the Victorian period, we also get something coming along parallel, the drinking of cocoa. The temperance movement takes off with a vengeance during the Victorian period to counteract pub culture. They want to offer people somewhere else to go, somewhere else that's warm and safe and friendly and comfortable and comforting. And what they come up with is the cocoa rooms. All over Britain they started to pop up. Now these places not just welcoming men, this is somewhere that women can go too. And you might, if you wander about Britain, even to this day, see the old faded signs, or sometimes in the brickwork above a building, that it might be a reading room and cocoa room, because they were offering a different sort of social thing. Now it might have faded away, but that doesn't mean it was any less important to the Victorians who enjoyed them. And while railways offered people the chance to see sport, to make it a spectator industry, of course, they also gave people access to a whole range of other leisure facilities. Perhaps rather surprisingly, the railways opened up a whole host of new outdoor leisure opportunities, including gardening. You see, with railways, people could begin to commute further distances to work, and that meant that new housing sprung up in a looser, wider sort of a context. People weren't all crammed into the city centres. The suburbs became a new phenomenon. And with these suburbs, with a little bit more space, came patches of land, and that opened up opportunities for all sorts of people. Gardening became a pastime for women and for the working classes in two slightly different ways, but nonetheless they were sharing the joy. For women, this was one of the very few ways in which they could engage with the outdoor world and yet still be considered respectable in their protected garden spaces. One magazine aimed at young women of a middle-class background called Gardening the Glory of the English Girl. And for working class people, well, it was an opportunity to escape, to have a break from the closed-in world of brick and fumes, to get a bit of fresh air, or as fresh as you could find, to be around green things, to grow your own food and to eat fresh flavours. It offered a new form of enjoyment, something small scale, fairly cheap, accessible, something you could share with your friends and neighbours, share with your family, and feel a bit more alive.
Next time we'll be looking at the Victorian school system, learning all about the ragged school movement and looking at how different the experience of school was for boys and girls and children of different social backgrounds.